What's up, guys? Welcome to class 2 on personal economics. Today we're going to dwell further on the principal-agent problem, a problem that actually was already introduced in class 1. But today we're going to explain this problem in more depth, as well as highlight how this problem can be solved both from the side of the employee, which we're going to refer to as the agent, and the employer or organization, so the principal, which is viewed here in this overview. Finally, we're going to talk a bit more about these problems in the real world, because of course reality is much more complex than a simple principal-agent model can display. So the goal of today's session is actually to show that the principal-agent problem is actually a foundation of our economy that's linked to very important aspects of motivation and the emergence and existence of different contracts. Finally, we're going to also focus on the assumptions of principal-agent problems, because of course reality is far more complex. And if we stick to the models, we don't account for unintended effects, which can result from the more simple principal-agent models. So today we'll be covering chapters 1, 2, 3, and 5 of the book, so not 4. Please note that today's session, and especially the book, contains a bit more theory and math. But don't worry, we'll focus on the essentials behind the numbers, theories, and formula. Today is a more theoretical lecture, but it actually serves a bit more as a foundation for later classes which are more applied. As always, slides stress how you should read the book, and I stress here what is important for you to maintain. Finally, before we continue, a quick note on terminology. The book talks a lot about workers and firms. I talk more about employees and organizations because that is more HR technology. Also know that I will use a lot he when talking about employees, organizations, and employers. That is, of course, not to say they cannot be female, but it's just to simplify my wording. Okay. Before we start, let's do a quick recap of class 1. So in the previous class, I highlighted that personal economics is about the application of economic theories and principles to human resource management problems. HR problem, which we will discuss in today's class and next week as well, is that of motivation. So how to motivate employees efficiently and effectively, so it's consuming a minimum amount of precious resources. We also said that in solving these issues, personal economics draws on 3 characteristics, so that employees and organizations are rational agents, meaning they act upon the information that they have available. And while doing, they want to maximize their welfare, often their financial welfare, which should result in one or more best solutions in organizing. The main topic of today originates in an issue which we introduced last time, and is also one of the foundations of personal economics, namely the separation of ownership and control. In a nutshell, within organizations, the person who owns the place is often not the person who does the work. So the person owning the place, we will here call him the principal, has to find people to work on his behalf, which we will call the agents. Since these people, these agents, are not motivated in se, the principal has to find a way to motivate these agents. With an example, okay, throughout the course I will use a lot of Star Wars examples. For the real fans, I simplify them a bit so everybody would understand them. Please don't come after me if you say what I say is not canon or that's not what Star Wars is like. It's just to have a bit of Star Wars in between. So imagine I'm a Dark Lord of an evil empire. So here, the organization. My empire is perfect. I got a cool suit, but I have some troubles with Jedi rebelling against me and hurting my prophets. Now, I could go after these Jedi myself, but that is time and effort consuming. Besides, I've already made some investment in material, I got a kick-ass evil base, I got some nice weapons, I got some nice spaceships. So instead, I will hire an agent to do the work for me. So that's this white guy, this stormtrooper over here. This, of course, raises a couple of questions, like, how much should I pay this agent? What is too little? What is too much? And, of course, how should I pay them? Should I pay him beforehand, before he starts the job? Should I pay him afterwards, based on his performance? Should I pay him like a mix of both, a bit beforehand, a bit afterwards? All these questions that I've now raised, they are actually part of what we call the principal-agent problem. Namely, what is the way to structure an arrangement between 2 parties? And note that there are a couple of elements in this definition. So best way, so this refers to one of the principles of personal economics, so that maximizes the welfare of both parties. There's also the element there of arrangement, so implies a kind of contract between parties. And there's also two parties there. So the two parties here, of course, meaning the principal or employer who hires and the agent or employee who performs. So the principal agent actually reflects a very basic and broad economic relationship that happens over and over again in our society. And this is not restricted to companies alone. When you go to the hairdresser, when you go to the car repair shop, when you hire a painter for your apartment, you are also a principal hiring an agent. Now, the principal agent problem follows a kind of timeline. And the timeline ranges so from offering the contract to the realization of profits. So what happens first? First, the principal, so the principal initiates. He will offer the agent a contract. So he will set the rules of the game. For example, I will tell the stormtrooper in the previous example he will earn 15 euros an hour and 100 euro bonus upon successfully capturing the Jedi. In doing, I will make use of backwards induction. What does this mean is I will try to predict, of course, how the agent, how the stormtrooper will respond. For example, if I offer the stormtrooper 10 euros an hour, will he or she accept my offer? No? Okay. Then I'll make it 15. So I try to predict how my agent will respond. So this is backwards induction. Based on this offer, the agent will accept or reject my offer. This is the participation constraint. In a normal market economy, you can't force employees to work for you. They're employees, not slaves. So they have to accept your contract, your offer first. So why might an agent accept or reject? Because, of course, you are not the only organization there. There might be other, better alternatives available. We call this the incentive comparability constraint. So the expected value of a contract is better than the alternatives. Finally, of course, the agent is paid and the profits are realized. So the stormtrooper catches my Jedi, I pay him, and we live happily ever after in my evil empire. Okay, concerning the final point, what are the payoffs or realized welfare of a contract for both the principal and the agent? We know both the principal and the agent, they of course want to maximize their welfare. Now the welfare of the principal is predominantly profit. Simply put, profit is revenue, or Q, minus the costs, Y. For example, I might sell the Jedi to another Dark Lord for some revenue. But of course, I have to take into account previous investment I've made in materials, so in weapons, in spaceships, in my evil base, and of course, the wage I've paid to the stormtrooper. So, profit equals revenue minus costs. This is the welfare of the principal. Now, the welfare of the agent is conceptualized as utility or benefit, which is compensation, or Y, minus the cost the agent has made. And what is the cost the agent has made here? Namely the effort, or VE. So this, the stormtrooper gets a wage, but also has invested some time, some energy, some sweat and blood in this work. And this is, of course, effort the stormtrooper could have spent in a different way, like walking in a hallway with a towel on. Problem is, like we said in the last lecture, this effort is actually, sorry, lost a bit my track over here, but that's fine. So, as I said in the last lecture, effort or labor is a commodity. And like many commodities, effort is costly. For example, imagine that you're studying for a test. Okay, you start out in the morning, all fresh, let's do this, let's nail this. But by the end of the evening, when you decide you need to pull an all-nighter, you find you have no energy left, and you have to invest far more effort in studying a chapter than in the morning. In economic terms, we would say this is because there is an increasing marginal cost associated with the efforts invested in studying. This is displayed as VE, or volatility of effort. and is displayed in this function you can see, so this utility effort function. This function shows that the relationship between effort and costs is non-linear. So you can't keep investing the same level of efforts. This would be a linear relationship, but it's rather non-linear because efforts are costly. You literally have to walk against a mountain to invest more energy later in the evening, because then you're tired. And we can find some examples of this idea in contemporary media debates. For example, some politicians or companies have suggested that people might be more productive under a 4-day work week. This suggestion builds upon the idea that effort is costly. Because, of course, one has to exert far more effort to be productive on a Friday afternoon than, say, a Tuesday morning. So I deliberately not choose Monday morning there. But costly effort also has some implications for how employees select between contracts. Employees often choose contracts where they get more income. Why? For less effort. Because, of course, you want to earn more while doing less, resulting in increasing utility, or U. For example, I want to work in a bar, but I find this evening and night hours more effort consuming, because of course I'm tired, I'm already drained from working from uni during the week. Instead, I might prefer to work for Jumbo during the day, which is less effort consuming, and that way I don't have to live off people's tipping money. So more financial benefits. This is all summarized indeed on slide 16. So welfare is expressed in profits for the principal and utility for the agent. To realize this welfare, principals have to invest costs and agents have to invest efforts. In return, the agent gets revenue. The principals get revenue and the agents get compensation or wage. I will call these formula utility functions. But of course, it's nearly impossible to solve the principal-agent problem for every employee or for every task every time again. So employers don't go, oh, what should I pay employee X to accept the contract for this task? What should I pay employee Y? What level of effort do they want to exert? Therefore, the market has invented a groundbreaking solution to solve the principal-agent problem, namely employment contracts. So what are employment contracts? They are basically a relation of economic and social dependence, with two main ingredients. So they are agreements to perform certain duties. So this is your job description, and agreements to perform these duties in exchange for a wage or salary. So the job description, of course, refers to the efforts an employee has to exert, while the wage or salary refers to compensation, so letter Y, we have seen in the formula earlier. So the formula for compensation is one of the most important in this course, so I certainly want to remember this. This will return in other classes. But if you take a close look, it's basically the same formula as a regression equation, where you also got like an intercept and a coefficient of direction. So this is a formula for compensation, Y, and it exists of base pay, so this is A, so this is the pay you get anyway, and B stands for incentive pay. We can also call this piece rate or commission rate, so pay that depends on performance. Performance here expressed as DE, or differences in effort. So what does this mean in practical terms? So in practical terms, wages you get are typically combinations of base pay and incentive pay. So you can either get like a fixed wage, let's say you earn 5,500 euros a month and nothing else, then A would be 1,500 and B would be 0 because there would be no incentive pay. But you could also be in a sales job. Let's say you get 1,000 a month, but 500 per unit you sell. If you sell for then 1 unit, you also get 1,500. 1,000 plus 1 times 500. Or you could be in a pure commission job. This is typically for sales jobs like in the US. You get 0 base pay, so you're certain of no pay, but it depends entirely on your performance. So A is 0, and then typically B is higher. Okay, so there are different constellations of base pay and incentive pay. This actually gives rise to 3 main types of contract. So first, as I already explained, is pure wage labor. So you only got fixed pay and no incentive pay. So A is different from 0 and B equals 0 because there are no incentives. But you could also be in share contracts. So these are combinations of incentive pay, either in combination with fixed pay or not. But could also be rental contracts, and rental contracts is where fixed pay is 0 or even negative. And here agents typically get a larger share of revenue. Okay, so an example of this latter type of contract that sounds a bit strange at first time is the delivery driver, actually. So delivery drivers, they typically have incentive pay, so B is positive, the driver gets paid per delivery, but there is no or even negative base pay. So the driver actually has to invest in his own bike, has to buy his own bike and cell phone, so actually has to make some investments before he can earn the incentive pay. So A is 0 or negative, while B is positive. Okay. At the other extreme, we find like the office worker. So this is typically pure wage labor. You only get fixed pay, no variable pay. Why is this? It's typically because among office workers, performance is invisible or is very hard to assess. This is also something we will discuss in class 3 and later in this class as well. In the middle, we find the bartender. So the bartender, at least in Europe, typically has some amount of base pay, so positive A. But in addition, he or she might earn some tip money. And we can consider here the tipping money as a variable B, because it's dependent on the performance. If you're a better bartender, if you service more clients, if you serve more clients qualitatively, you typically get more tipping money. Okay. And here we get a bit more mathematical, but as you will see, still easy peasy. Now, earlier we said that agent's utility, or U, equals compensation, so Y, minus the efforts he or she has exerted. And now we have learned that actually compensation, so this Y, equals base pay plus variable pay. Now if we put those together, we can calculate agent's utility. So utility refers to the sum of base pay plus variable pay minus the efforts he or she has exerted. Now, in comparing the utilities of two contracts, we know that agents will choose those with the highest marginal benefit. The marginal benefit is expressed as BE. So the value or the pay he or she gets for differences in effort. Also, she will take account of the lowest marginal cost. So that is the differences in effort he or she has to exert. And let's illustrate this with an example of a woman selling spaceship. Yes, we stick to the space theme for now. Okay. So what is this example, the marginal benefit? That's the first question. Second question is, what when another company offers her 900 euros? So lower base pay, but a higher piece rate. So she gets 600 instead of 500. Is it worth making the switch? And finally, what if she decides to sell 2 spaceships a month? Say she has to make a lot of calls, contact a lot of clients, and she says, well, okay, I can do 2 a month, but 3, that's just too much follow-up. Now, this is an example of a simple calculation exercise based on the formula we have seen earlier that you could get on the exam. Now, normally this is an exercise we would do together in class collectively, but since this is an online course, here I have provided the solution on slides and I will go through the solution together with you. So, what is the marginal benefit of selling an additional spaceship? Now, the formula for marginal benefit is displayed here. So it's B times differences in effort. So what is the marginal benefit of selling an additional spaceship? It equals piece rate times effort, or B times E, which of course here is 1 times 500. So what does this mean? The additional benefit of selling an additional spaceship is 500 euros. So if a saleswoman managed to do 3 spaceships a month instead of 2, what is the additional benefit? Well, it's 500 euros. So the B for 1 difference in effort. Now what when she gets an offer from another firm? Now if we calculate the utilities for one spaceship, we'll see they are exactly the same, namely 1,500. So in the first contract, so the base contract, she gets 1,000 euros a month base pay plus 500 a month, 500 per spaceship, which equals, of course, 1,500. Now, if we go to the second contract, we see that she gets lower base pay but higher variable pay. But for one spaceship, this is still 1,500 because 900 plus 600, of course, still equals 1,500. So they are exactly the same, despite the second contract having higher marginal benefits. But for two spaceships, we have a different story. So if she sells two spaceships under first contract, she'll get 1,000 plus 2 times 500, which of course is 2,000. Well, in the second contract, so she gets 900 plus 600 times 2. This is a mistake, this has to be 2, equals 2,100. So what does this mean? It actually means that the choice depends on the optimal effort level. So while contract 2 has a higher marginal benefit, so they give her 500 per spaceship, give her 600 per spaceships instead of 500, the utility for the spaceships is the same. But the optimal effort level for two spaceships, the utility is higher, because here she would gain 100 euros more, so here she is advised to switch. We can also draw this. So note A is the intercept. So this is the starting position. This is where the line crosses the axis. And we see indeed here for one effort level, the utility is the same. So it's still 1,500, both for contract 1 and both for contract 2. Well, for E2, so if she sells two spaceships, utility is higher in the second contract. So here she would earn 2,100 instead of 2,000. Now, something we introduced in this exercise is the idea of optimal effort. Optimal effort is denoted by E asterisk, and that is employees will not keep working until they drop. Rather, as we see sometimes among like salespeople or self-employed, they will calculate a kind of optimal effort. Okay, what then is the optimal effort for agents? It's where agent feels that their efforts, so their marginal costs, reflect their compensation, so their marginal benefits. In other words, where effort equals pay or variable pay. So where employees get paid the value of their efforts. The idea behind optimal efforts is that employees get paid according to their optimal effort level will continue business as usual. Yeah? So you get, if you feel you get what you deserve, you will just stick and continue what you are doing. You won't increase or decrease your effort level. For example, the saleswoman in the example, she will continue to sell two spaceships if she feels she can make a living and is adequately compensated for the effort she has invested in it. If an employee is not paid according to the efforts, they will try to restore this balance or equilibrium. Because, of course, remember, in personal economics, people try to restore the equilibrium. There is a kind of equilibrium. If employees get paid less than their effort, they will also perform less. So as the cliche goes, indeed, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. Something people often used to argue in favor of high CEO pay. You get what you pay for. If you pay your employees low, you're likely to perform less. Employees that get paid more than optimal efforts, they will feel a kind of psychological tension or guilt to do more. This is typically something they do with the wages of high potentials in consultancies or traineeships. Typically, when you go in these kind of jobs, you earn a higher pay than some of your peers. This is to stimulate a kind of tension or guilt, so for you to perform more. So what can we learn for this? It seems mostly that piece rates or variable Bs are effective at stimulating employees to work harder, because they are coupled to effort. Employees seem more indifferent to A. And I think, and with an example, this could indeed be the case. For example, I get paid a fixed wage. If Doreen, my head of department, would say, Robin, this month you'll make 100 euros extra a month. So I would say, nice, but I would not necessarily work harder. Maybe thinking about optimal effort, I value my efforts higher. But by contrast, if you would tell a delivery driver that he or she can make €5 per delivery more, he or she would start cycling very hard. So fixed pay typically doesn't really motivate employees to exert extra effort, while piece rate or variable B, they are very good at motivating employees because they are directly coupled to effort. So far, we only talked about agents or employees. Knowing how agents judge contracts to be more attractive, the next logical question is, okay, how much should principals or employers pay? So the principals problem is to figure out how a high piece rate, so B has to be, and how much base pay, or A, has to be in order to maximize his or her profits. In other words, the principal wants the wage to be as low as possible for an effort as high as possible. So basically, the principal is playing limbo. How low can you go? However, in playing limbo, the principal also has to take into account the following. First, of course, the participation constraints. Employees have to agree on the contract. They can be forced. And also the incentive comparability constraints. That is, employees will seek better alternatives if they are available, so pay still has to be attractive in some kind of way. So in scientific words, what do I have to pay employees to ensure I don't pay too much and they work their ass off? Well, you can calculate this, and this calculation is fully worked out in the book. So I don't want you to focus on that, but more important than the calculation is the answer. And the answer might come a bit as a surprise. That is, if you work the calculation out, you see employees are most productive and profits are maximized when you pay them B equals 1, or 100% of their efforts. In other words, employees are more productive when they can keep 100% of their revenue. So in delivery terms, it would be a person pays 12 euros for the pizza and you give the driver 12 euros. Well, at first sight, it doesn't make sense because then you don't earn anything as an organization. And I guess now most of you are confused. How does this make sense? Well, for employers or organizations, it might make sense to do the following. That is, put the rewards where the decisions are made. That is, make employees bear all the costs, but also all the fruits of their labor. Now, how does the organization then make money? Simple, by selling the job to the worker or with negative base pay. And already I highlighted this a bit when I talked about the Deliveroo example first. So if you are puzzled, consider the following popular examples. So companies like Deliveroo, Tupperware, Ergo, they are all companies where you typically first have to make investments before you can work for them. That is, you have to buy a car, you have to buy a bike, or you have to pay for training. And after these investments, it's all up to you. That is, you bear the risk, but also, let's say, almost all of the benefits. It's up to you how much meals you deliver, plastics you sell, or insurances you give to people. They actually don't care anymore. So these are actually jobs with negative base pay and variable B. We call this selling the job to the worker. And there are actually three forms of selling the job to the worker. First one is explicit payment for jobs. I think the best example here is about CrossFit. And I hope there are not many CrossFitters among you. But basically, CrossFit is a US company, and all they do is own the name CrossFit. If you want to set up your own CrossFit gym and use their name, you have to pay them shitloads for training and just for using the name CrossFit. So you pay them to be a CrossFit trainer in the first place before you have even made €1 single profit. But of course, afterwards, you can ask and earn what you want. So first, you have to make some investments, negative A, and afterwards, doesn't matter. You can ask as a variable B yourself what you want. Second one is the franchise solution. Now this basically means you could hire a person to do the job, or you could sell it to the worker. And often organizations do this when the job does not belong to their core competencies. Best example here are actually the Starbucks and Esplanade on university campus. So the university wants to offer students and staff some food and some coffee. Now, they could hire staff to do this for them. Yeah? But then, of course, they still have to manage, and they have to invest in staff, they have to keep stocks. And besides, it's not really a core competency of a university, is it? So what is the solution? Well, they have the premises ready and they rent it out, so others can set up a bar or restaurant and keep all the profits. So here, A is also negative. It's actually the rent Esplanade and Starbucks pay to university to use this premise. But B is variable, but these are, of course, their sales. So they keep their own sales. They don't have to give a part of their sales to the university. They just pay for the rent. A final version is more implicit payment for jobs. So in many cases, workers, of course, might be reluctant, either for reasons of like trust or liquidity, to make up a large upfront payment for a job. Let's say they have no money for buying a bike or renting a location for a restaurant. The solution then is to build the entry fee into the pay schedule. That is, employees pay, they have variable B, but they pay a small percentage of this commission of B's rate to the organization as a kind of entry fee. While not an ideal example, this is close to companies like Ergo. They sell insurance, life insurance, and pension funds to people. And typically, the employees they work with are like falsely self-employed. So they sell insurances, and part of that insurance they pay as a commission to the organization, which acts as a kind of entry fee. So conclusion, what is the optimal contract for the principal? What's the optimal contract for the principal or employer? It's a contract where employees pay organizations for job. So with a negative or 0A and a full commission rate. So employees receiving 100% of B or of revenue. Of course, during this class, some of you might have frowned and think, okay, but is this how it really goes in reality? It's just a model, it's just some formula. And indeed, most models and idea about the principal-agent problem in personal economics, they rest upon a couple of assumptions, while reality might be a whole different story. I will end this second class by discussing 8 of these assumptions. Now, the first 2 of these assumptions are more straightforward. First is we assume there are no diminishing returns to agents' efforts, so no decreases in marginal output. However, we know in reality, if you work 80 hours on painting a fence, it does not necessarily make it a better painted fence than if you work 8 hours on that fence. Or if you work with 20 persons on the same task, it does not make it necessarily more effective than if you work on the task with 4 people. In other words, investing more effort is not always more efficient or more effective at executing a task. Second assumption is, of course, as we said, effort is costly. This is an assumption, but again, I think we can agree that this applies to reality as well. No worker can provide unlimited effort. Third assumption is more important, is that in this class we always talked about one agent or one employee. In reality, however, within organizations there are multiple employees, and they too can make deals with their employers. And in HR specifically, we call this ideals. These are idiosyncratic deals that employees make with their employer. So for example, they ask their boss for more time, for more flexibility. Now, what happens is the existence of these deals makes some employees, well, they get kind of jealous. Like it stimulates other employees to renegotiate their own terms. For example, if I see my colleague has a company car, well, not in the wildest dreams universities have it, but still, if I see my colleague has a company car, I would go to my boss and ask for one as well. even though I would not miss a car in the first place. So the existence of these kind of ideals among employees stimulates other employees to also renegotiate their deals and make ideals of their own. Another thing single agent does not account for is the involvement of the principal. That is, the principal or employer might still have a say or a responsibility over what happens even when the job is sold to the worker. For example, this can be through advertisement to maintenance. The fact that the university has rented out the premises to Starbucks or to Esplanade doesn't mean they can't advertise or they don't do window cleaning. So even production or success can still depend on more than one party. Fourth assumption is that agents have a single output, a single task. Now, in reality, in most jobs and organizations, they are multidimensional. And it's far harder to measure employees' output or productivity when it consists of multiple dimensions. Therefore, some organizations have introduced multidimensional performance management systems. So these are systems that plan, monitor, and evaluate employees' efforts. However, when they are not designed well, the systems might backfire, and they might lead to what we call effort misallocation problems. To explain this, I will use the example of junior professors like myself. Now, junior professors like myself, they are typically subjected to performance management systems that incentivize two tasks: teaching and research. Typically, these performance management systems are incomplete. Why? Because they tend to value one task over another. That is, typically such systems incentivizes research over teaching. Now, why are research tasks over-incentivized? Well, it's simply because they are more observable. What makes a good researcher? Simple. Publications in high-quality journals, attending conferences, making speeches, all visible stuff. Now, what makes a good teacher? Well, that's a more broader, that's a more difficult question to answer. There's a lot more aspects to being a good teacher. For example, student evaluations, they can give an education, but they're also very much tied to course content and to teacher characteristics. For example, we know for research that female teachers and teachers of difficult subjects, well, they score lower than, let's say, male teachers or teachers who teach simple subjects. Now, of course, what will rational junior professors do? Junior professors as rational agents, they will invest more time in research, so in the visible performance, than in teaching the invisible performance. So they will reallocate their efforts towards more incentivized tasks. Or what they will also do is game performance. Now, what is game performance? Game performance is actually goals becoming ends in themselves. For example, if I have a difficult course and I want my student evaluations to go up, what I could consider is just leave out the most difficult parts, and I will see that my teaching evaluations will rise. Now, these kind of problems, so gaming and reallocation of efforts, they typically happens when tasks are substitute. That means when employees have no preference of doing one task over the other. When employees have a preference, these tasks are complements. So in sum, when incentive systems like performance management systems are incomplete, employees tend to reallocate their efforts toward tasks that are, one, more incentivized. This is one. Two, tasks that are more observable. And three, tasks that are substitute, so that they don't care doing one task over the other. And actually, this is not limited to junior professors. Two other examples. For example, many cities hire external firms to give out parking fines. Now, studies show that these private firms simply write more fines. The reason is not only the revenue from the fines, but is also to make performance visible. These parking companies want to show to the cities that they matter and that they take things seriously. Another thing is appendix surgery. Now, past reports show that many times appendix surgeries are performed without there really being a medical need. Why? Because it's a very easy routine operation and it's very visible in the statistics. So doctors and hospitals demonstrate they matter. It can also be a more lucrative way of earning money. So these are two examples of gaming. So goals gone wild or becoming goals in themselves, ends in themselves. Now, how could we solve such effort reallocation problems? We could try to make performance management more complete. How could we do this? For example, additional criteria, including additional incentives. Or exactly the opposite, we could lower the incentives for some task so that employees have more attention to other tasks that are not or less incentivized. Another thing we could do is hire intrinsically motivated employees. So we'll talk more about this next week in class 3 about intrinsic motivation. So these are employees that derive satisfaction purely from performing the task itself. The final thing we can do is link incentive systems to job design. And this is what most organizations do. So in jobs with observable performance, let's say, for example, sales, you see whether I've sold 1 unit or 3 units or 5 units. In these type of jobs, incentives are typically higher than in jobs where performance is more hard to observe. For example, in office jobs. Does office worker A worked more today than yesterday? We don't really know. We can only guess or ask him. The fifth assumption is that the basic principal-agent model does not account for uncertainty or unpredictable events in the production process. For example, luck, market fluctuations, or external events or shocks. For example, you open a new business in town, ice cream parlor, up you go, and there comes Corona, gone are the sales. Or you are an egg farmer, and in comes fipronil. So last year there was a fipronil scandal, there was a kind of lice on the chickens, so egg sales dropped tremendously. If you're an egg farmer, this is bad news. Or it could also go the other way. Imagine I have started a business selling barbecues, and suddenly it's the warmest summer in decades. My sales go up. So these are actually events we can't control. So we call this uncertainty or state of nature. This is indicated with the Greek letter epsilon. Now, uncertainty might have some effects on what is the optimal contract. When times are tough, employees might be less interested in being sold the job. So selling the job to the worker might be attractive to organizations or employers, but in certain times, there is still this participation constraint. So employees won't really like this kind of solution in uncertain times. You are not opening a franchise during an economic crisis. So some positive base pay might be necessary here to convince those employees to get into the contract in the first place. Another solution is to build some kind of insurance into the contracts. That is actually something we see very frequently in seasonal labor like fruit picking or in some kind of theme parks. As some contracts offer employees a high base time in bad times, or let's say when sales are low, for example, this could be in winter times, and lower in good times, so during summer or during spring or fall when there is harvesting, when there is tourists coming to the theme parks. This is building some kind of insurance. So the higher pay in one season accounts for the lower pay in bad season, and they balance each other out. Final assumption is that incentive schemes are linear, which means that an increase of 1 unit in effort leads to an increase of 1 unit in compensation. Now, in reality, some organizations might reward you more as you perform more. We call this an accelerating piece rate. So the marginal benefit of an additional unit increases beyond a certain level. For example, if you sell more than 3 cars in a month, from the 4th car on, you earn 600 euros per car instead of 500 euros per car. But some organizations also employ the opposite. For example, I have heard, so take this example with some care, but have heard that Deliveroo's algorithm actually increases the distance between orders as bikers deliver more orders in order to avoid paying too much to one driver. So this is an example of a decelerating piece rate. That is, it decreases the marginal benefit of an additional unit beyond a certain level. Now, funny thing is, while this sounds very advantageous for organizations, it also creates unintended effects. For example, if you get extra awards for selling 5 cars a month, and you see, this month it's not going well, I've only sold 2 cars, you can consider moving those sales to next month. So force your client or convince your client to sell the contract, not now, but next year. And that is indeed something we typically see in companies that employ this kind of accelerating and decelerating piece rate, is they have kind of bumps in their production and fiscal years. We call this time gaming problems. So this employees changing the timing of their efforts, for example, by dating contracts, in response to nonlinear reward schemes. Yes, so these are the main takeaways. First is principal-agent problem is all over in our economy. To solve this problem, organizations have proposed employment contracts. There are, of course, optimal contracts for both employees and employers. For employees, it's where their efforts are reflected in their pay. In doing, we see those employees are more incentivized by piece rates, so by variable pay, than they are by fixed pay. Why? Because variable pay is directly tied to performance, while in fixed pay, it's not tied to performance. It doesn't matter if you have a fixed wage. If you work more or less, you will always earn the same. The optimal contract for employers is selling the job to the worker, so meaning where A, so fixed pay, is either 0 or negative, and there is a positive commission rate which is fully paid to the employee. Now, of course, this doesn't apply in case of uncertainty. What could be typical exam questions about this class? It's comparing different contracts or different kind of assumptions and how they would change, like the agency, the principal-agent problem, or do like the exercise we did, a utility calculations, compare 2 or 3 different contracts and what happens if there is an optimal effort level introduced. I also want to repeat indeed with regards to the math formula, only know the stuff that is included in class, so on slides, so you don't have to do all the math that's in the book. The book is far more extensive in this case. I focus here on the essentials and the philosophy behind the math. Exam is open book, of course, but I still want you to recognize indeed different kind of formula. So I will never say what is the formula for, let's say, compensation, but still if I say like y is 1500, I want you to deduce what it means. Next week, we're going to continue with motivation employees. We're going to focus on non-monetary incentives instead of monetary incentives. So today we talked a lot about money and pay, but actually, as we already know or suspect, there's a far broader motivation base that employees draw upon. So we're going to also focus on things like intrinsic motivation and public service motivation, image motivation, and so on. We're also going to focus more on reciprocity. Remember, man is not homo economicus, he's also homo reciprocans. And next week is also more applied, so less math and more experiments and situations in real life. Okay, this is it. So I will be available on the chat this Wednesday. Thank you for listening to Class 2 and see you next week.